Welcome to Casual Friday. Hi, I'm Roxanne Richardson, and this is my weekly Casual Friday podcast. If you'd like to jump right to a specific point in the video, you can tap or mouse over the video playback area of the screen to reveal the chapter titles and starting points of each section of the video. This week I have tidbits. I have another finished item for Finish It February, and I want to tell you about my next vintage sweater project and what I've done to get started on that so far. So let's get started. This first tidbit came to me in my Twitter feed in the past week, and it's a clip from an Australian television program from 1971. So it's 50 years old, and it was for a knitting speed competition, and it was like the finals. And they had one competitor from each Australian state, and so they kind of talked to each of the women a little bit, and they explained what the competition actually was. The link, I'll leave the link down below. It isn't for the entire program. I wish it was, because I would be really interested to see what the outcome was, because they didn't tell you in this particular clip who the winner was. But they did do a little bit of talking to each of the women. They talked about what the competition actually was. Now, in current times, there are these speed knitting competitions, and they tend to go back and forth between continental knitters and then English style knitters. And so Hazel Tyndall is, I think she's from Scotland. She often wins, and she uses a knitting belt, and she uses her right hand to control the yarn, but she very much uses that Shetland style of knitting, which is very fast. But you know, there is no faster method of knitting. There are just faster knitters. And when I look sometimes at, well, I wonder how fast I could actually knit, I don't have the ability. I don't have the fast twitch muscles that you would need to be able to actually move the needle that fast. Like, I physically, just even for one stitch, can't move something that quickly. So I think there's a combination of, you know, years of practice, really ergonomic, efficient knitting style, combined with fast twitch muscles, like just being able having that coordination to be able to do that. So I would never win any sort of speed competition, not that I would be interested in entering, but it was really interesting to see this. It's about 5 minutes long, a segment of this knitting competition, because it isn't the way that I have seen modern ones done, where everybody has a certain number of stitches, and then they see how many stitches you can knit in a particular amount of time. This instead was, they had to knit 8 different swatches. So there were different stitch patterns that they had to produce. The judges they spoke to a little bit were talking about how they often could figure out by just watching them knit, sort of the personality of the knitter. They would be able to tell who was probably going to win, because it took a certain personality to just remain very calm and not kind of get overtaken by nerves. But I'm going to leave that link to that video down in the description, because I thought it was a really interesting piece of social history. So this next tidbit came as a result from the comments and questions that people have sent my way since I bought 3 vintage knitting kits a few weeks ago. And so these knitting kits included yarn plus a skirt length of coordinating fabric. And so I got a lot of comments from people saying that they remembered their mother having a kit like that, or their mother making them a sweater with a matching skirt when they were young, or even in one case someone said her father bought her yarn and the fabric so she could make that outfit herself. So a lot of fond memories coming from people. Several Canadians mentioned to me that there were Canadian companies that manufactured the cloth and yarn for these kits in Canada, that they weren't always just imported from Scotland, because a lot of these kits included hand-woven fabric from Scotland, and then they would have this yarn that would go with it. So one person told me that there was a company called Cottage Craft that produced these kits themselves in New Brunswick. So I looked up advertisements on newspaper.com and I did find some advertisements, and I kind of got interested in what Cottage Craft was. It turns out that company still exists. They're not still producing kits that include yarn and coordinating fabric, but the company still exists. It turns out that the company was started by a woman named Grace Helen Mowat, who was born in 1875 in a rural area of New Brunswick called St. Andrews. So she grew up in St. Andrews, and then she went to college. She got a degree in art, and she was an art teacher. She never married, but when she was about 32 years old, apparently she had a nervous breakdown and returned back to her hometown in St. Andrews. And a few years later, she wanted to do something to help these rural communities, especially the women, generate some sort of income themselves. And so she created this company called Cottage Craft, or Charlotte County Cottage Crafts. And they were selling pottery and weaving that was produced by these women locally. And she ran Cottage Craft until about 1945. But the company still exists. And there's apparently a book written about her that is available on Amazon. I haven't read the book, so I thought you guys might enjoy reading about Grace and her legacy. So this next tidbit came to me from the Finish It February discussion thread in my Ravelry group. So one of the participants, Trevor, who is creating really beautiful knitted items, lives in Spain. And one of the items that he wanted to finish was this blanket that was a natural cream color blanket, and it had these bands of stitch patterns on it like you'd see on a Gansey sweater. So these kind of knit purl patterns in these horizontal bands. And it was most of the way done, but he just had a couple inches left to go, and it had just been sitting there for a few years. And he mentioned that he had gotten the yarn up in the mountains of Spain, and it was kind of a breed of sheep that had been sort of endangered. Like it was, there were fewer and fewer shepherds who were breeding these sheep. And that he had bought the yarn at this cooperative. There's this cooperative of weavers and other creators that are working with the shepherds to bring these sheep back. And that's where he had bought the wool. And somebody else in the group found a video on Vimeo about this cooperative that I thought was really interesting. The video is in Catalan, which is one of the languages in Spain, but you can put the closed captions on in English, Catalan, or Spanish, and then you can read along and see what it is they're talking about. This is a breed I had never heard of at all, so I thought you guys might be interested. This next tidbit came to me by way of my Twitter feed, and it was a presentation. It was a book launch, actually, and I found out about it about an hour and a half before it happened. So the book is called Material Lives: Women, Makers, and Consumer Culture in the 18th Century. So this was presented as part of this Sartorial Society series. That's a website, and so it's these academics who specialize in fashion history as well as material culture. And so they have a presentation every couple of weeks that they record, and then they leave that recording up on their website for a month, and then it gets taken down. So this one just went up on Thursday, and it'll be up for about 4 weeks. So I will leave that below. The book focuses on 4 specific women and the way that they sort of documented their lives, like the way that they created things that leave us this trail of seeing a little bit into their lives, and at a time when mostly women were documented only as somebody's wife or mother or daughter. So they're really interesting collections. One of them was a collection of dolls that a woman had made, and she would make clothing from the same material that her own dresses had been made from. So there's one that was like a copy of her wedding dress, for example. And so she would hand sew all of this. And then when she married and had children, about the time her daughters were 7 or 8 years old, you could see that the stitching became more childlike. Like she was using these dolls as a way of teaching her own daughters these sewing skills. And apparently these dolls were kept on display in their house. It wasn't just something that was done and put away. It was on display. And so this is something that spanned many decades of her life. Another woman made a watercolor, she called it the dress of the year. Each year she would do a watercolor of one of her dresses. And apparently there was an exhibit about the dress of the year at that time, and like that you could go and see. And this woman used that idea and translated into her own sort of documentation of her dress of the year. And she did this for many, many decades as well. The third one was a scrapbook that a woman started when she was 8 years old, and she continued through until she was into her 80s. And it's a scrapbook that has pieces of fabric from different items of clothing that were made for her, and the notes about it. They might include fashion plates that indicated how this piece of fabric was turned into a gown like you might have seen in the fashion plate. But this, again, it documented nearly 8 decades of this woman's life. And then the final one was correspondence between a woman, her dressmaker, and her draper who supplied the fabric for her dresses. So there would be written communication and little scrap of fabric with how much that fabric would cost per yard, and just sort of this discussion between the three people about this woman's clothing. And it was sort of a set of accounts as well, keeping track of her expenditures as well. And again, this went on for decades. So it's an interesting idea, a different way of looking at how women may have created documentation of their lives in ways that these are unique in that they survive. Like the majority of the collection survives and we can see them. And her point is that they probably were not unique women in that way. There probably were many women who created things that documented their lives, but maybe just don't survive or only survive in bits and pieces. So I'll leave a link to the Sartorial Society series as well as to the book. It's being sold by Bloomsbury, and I think there's both a UK and a US link for that, but I will include those down below. My last tidbit is just to let you know I will be doing a live stream Q&A on my channel this weekend on Sunday around noon Central Time here in the US. So that will be about 6 o'clock in the UK, 7 o'clock in Western Europe, and I think probably very early in the morning in places like New Zealand and Australia. But I haven't done a Technique Tuesday video in the past couple of weeks because I'm developing a series of videos that is taking quite a bit of planning and also execution in terms of getting the knitting done for it and just planning this series. So I wanted to kind of make up for the fact that I haven't done a technique video in the past couple of weeks, and I thought I'd do a Q&A. So if you have questions about me, about knitting, about whatever, you can bring them to the live stream on Sunday, and I will be happy to answer them if I can. So I have one final project that I finished for Finish It February, and that is my Aran sweater. I'm going to stand up to get my face out of the camera because pale face, dark yarn, it makes it hard to see the dark yarn. So I'm going to stand up, and I think you'll be able to see better what's going on with this sweater. So this is a natural black yarn. So this comes from a sheep that's called a Zwart Bless sheep, and I bought the yarn from the shepherd who farms these animals in Ireland. Her name is Susanna Crampton, and she has a website called Zwart Bless Ireland. I started following her on Twitter about 3 years ago during lambing season. Watching sort of this farmer on a daily life, you know, managing this small sheep farm on her own, and how committed she is to the biodiversity of the land in terms of the insects that live on her land, and the birds, and the grasses and plants and all of that. She really pays attention to creating this biodiversity. So I had been at the time looking for yarns made from breed-specific wools, because I wanted to experiment with them, because I was really just buying regular commercial wool yarns and not really paying much attention to the breeds, and I wanted to learn more about it. So I was just so interested in what she was doing, and I thought her sheep were just so beautiful. So I decided to buy myself the yarn for my birthday that year. And then after that, when I received the yarn, it was such a different yarn than I'd ever experienced. And I don't know that at this point that it has anything to do with the fact that it's Zwartbles. I think it has to do with how the yarn was constructed. And I really didn't know a whole lot about yarn construction and different ways that wool was processed and prepared and spun in order to create yarns, and then what kind of effect that has on the knitting experience and then the fabric that you end up with. So it would be interesting to me at some point to try some Zwartbles yarn that is worsted spun. This is woolen spun. Took me a while to really learn how to work with this yarn because it was so different from what I was used to. And so in the past few years, I've learned a lot more, and especially in the past year, I've learned a lot more about yarn construction and being able to tell how yarns are constructed by looking at them, but understanding the qualities of that kind of yarn and what's going to happen after it's washed, and how it's going to wear versus how warm it's going to be. So this woolen spun yarn, I've been told that woolen spun yarn is a lot warmer, and I can tell you this sweater is very warm. It is warmer than this Aran sweater that I have that is made from worsted spun yarn, and this is actually made from more yards of yarn than this is. So during the process of making this sweater, I learned a lot about yarn construction, sometimes from this yarn, but sometimes from other explorations of yarn construction. And then when I would come back to the sweater after having a break from it, I would have a different perspective on the yarn behavior. So it's been a really interesting 3 years working on this sweater, and I'm really happy with it. I was really happy, always really happy with my red sweater, but there were things about this red sweater that I didn't like as much as, it was fine, totally wearable, one of my favorite sweaters, but it was the kind of thing that when I finished this sweater and I showed it to a friend of mine who was an excellent knitter, and I said, well, the neck is kind of wide on this. I really don't want, and I don't want to reknit it. And she's like, well, so for next time that you want the neck to be not as wide. So you've learned something, and now you know for next time. You don't need to fix that one. And so I've always remembered that. And now it's been like 15 years since I started this red sweater. Necklines are wider, and so it doesn't look too wide to other people. I do like a snugger neck. So this one I designed to be closer fitting than this one, and I really like that. One of the things that I did with my red sweater was that I wanted it to be, the sleeves to fit more like a shirt, like to be more close fitting. And I did that, and I liked it, but I felt taking it too far narrow at the cuff, and I wished that it was a little bit looser. So I made this one a little bit looser at the cuff. I'm much happier with that. So every sweater that I design for myself, I like, oh, okay, I like that, but here I'd rather that, it's just a learning experience for every sweater. So I love both of these sweaters. They're very different, and yet they're very much the same in a lot of ways. And I learned a lot from knitting each of them. And now I know more. for next time. I'm going to leave some links to Zwartbles Ireland, to her website and her Twitter feed and stuff, because it's lambing season right now. So it's really fun to see the baby lambs running around with their mothers, and they're just so cute. And so if you like a little daily dose of cuteness, you might really enjoy her Twitter feed. My next sweater project is going to be part of my long-term project to knit a sweater from each decade of the 20th century. I've gone from the 1890s up to the 1930s, and because I happened to buy several vintage sweater kits off eBay a few weeks ago that were from the 1960s and included some patterns. So I've decided to knit one of the patterns from one of the kits, but using the yarn from another kit. From the kit that I'm going to use, I will also make a skirt. So these kits were really popular in the 1960s. This idea of yarn with coordinating fabric dates back at least to the 1930s. So I found a number of advertisements starting in the 1930s for these coordinating fabrics and yarns. And so sometimes they come in kit form, like by the 1950s I was seeing them as kits. But I was sometimes also seeing them being advertised just as the shop carries these coordinating things. And so you could buy as much of either one of them as you wanted rather than being given a set quantity of them. So I've had a few questions about people when I was showing them these kits that I bought. I bought them on eBay, and a number of people have gone to eBay and have not been able to find any kits like this and were wondering what search terms I used. So that's always the trick, is when you find something new, is figure out how to search for it. And part of the problem with something like this that is more than 50 years old is there's going to be a limited number of them out there. And so you'll never know when they might show up on eBay. And because I was showing this on my YouTube channel and 6,000 or 7,000 people have seen that video, a fair handful of you have decided to see if you could find some yourself. So it might just take time. I think when I started looking just for vintage and antique knitting books, you know, it just took a while to figure out what to search for. And when I started buying manuals, knitting manuals that actually had how-to instructions, I wanted to see how people were instructing, like for best practices. It took me until I found an actual title and author name of a book before I was able to really start collecting books from that period of time. I needed a name. So people have been asking me, well, what are the search terms? So the way I had success was by knowing a company name that existed that had these kits. That's where I started. And that company was Andrew Stewart. And it was a company from the UK, but there were other companies that sold these kinds of kits. As I've been telling people about these kits and showing them to them, people have told me, oh, a friend of mine bought me a kit like that from a garage sale. And here, you know, we're in these Zoom knitting groups, and let me go get it. She'll go, it was a completely intact kit. And it was from a downtown department store here in the Twin Cities called Dayton's. And she still had the original store receipt was inside there. And so she knew when the date was, and that particular brand was, the wool fabric was from Pringle of Scotland, and then the yarn that was in the kit was Bernat. So it was like two different companies that were combined as a kit. So it could be, if you search generically for vintage sweater kit with fabric, that you might get a hit, but you also might want to just try searching for specific brands as well. So some of these ads that I've been showing on the screen might be helpful for you for putting on like a watch list or something on eBay, or searching in other places as well. So these things come up. I mean, eBay is where I'm willing to go look. I'm not going to go to estate sales and garage sales and charity shops looking for these kinds of things. But sometimes people who really enjoy going to those kinds of places, because they can sometimes find these treasures, that's how they might find them. And sometimes people might find these treasures and not want them themselves, and then they might put them up on eBay, and then you'll be able to buy them. So I have had people asking me if they could buy the kit that I for sure am not going to use, and the answer to that is no, because I want one of the kits. Of the 3 kits, one of them was absolutely complete, had all the yarn, had all the fabric, had the buttons, and came with patterns. And so, and it's also the one that I'm least interested in actually using in terms of the color, but I'm also the most interested in preserving in terms of having a piece of social history that lasts. The other 2 kits were partial in some way. One of the kits is missing some yarn, and I will be using that kit for my 1940s project, because it'll be sort of that not quite enough resources to make a sweater type of mentality from the 1940s, a make do and mend type of idea. So I'll be using that kit for the 1940s, and then the 3rd kit had all the fabric and all the yarn, but no patterns. And the yarn is a different brand. And so it is worked at a different gauge than the pattern calls for. So the Andrew Stewart patterns call for, they have this yarn that is worked at 8 stitches per inch. And the yarn I'm going to be using is worked at 7.5 stitches per inch. So because my pattern comes in 5 sizes, I am going to be knitting the size that is smaller than what I really want, but at the gauge that I'm going to be working at. So for example, instead of knitting the size 38 sweater at 8 stitches per inch, I'm going to be knitting the size 36 sweater, but at 7.5 stitches per inch. And I compared the numbers to make sure that the sweater would come out the size that I wanted using that gauge. So I've confirmed all that. So that's what I'm going to be doing. That Andrew Stewart pattern, it has a really cool yoke. And one of my goals in these kinds of projects, these vintage projects, is selecting a pattern that has something I can learn from. Often has a construction process that I haven't seen before, and that one certainly qualifies. So a lot of you, I've gotten a lot of questions about the pattern as well, because many of you have been intrigued by the yoke and have asked me if I will post the pattern instructions so that they can see how this is made. And I can't do that. I can't like post an image of the pattern instructions. This was something that was published in the 1960s in the UK, and so it is not in the public domain. It is still under copyright. Finding who the current copyright owner is a little trickier, and it may in fact be what's called an orphaned document or orphaned publication, but that doesn't mean I have the right to display the instructions on that pattern page. What I can do though is show you how it is constructed and explain that to you. So one of the first things I do whenever I start any project is I create a spreadsheet, and I go through the pattern and look at the stitch counts and the shaping, and I calculate the total stitch count as I'm going. And because that gives me a sense of how long it's going to take me to knit when I see what the total stitch count is. It also allows me, as I finished the first ball or 2 of yarn, and I can see how many stitches it takes, and I can confirm that I have enough yarn for the project. So I always create a spreadsheet regardless. The next thing that I do for vintage patterns is frequently I always create a schematic, because those vintage patterns didn't include a schematic. And so I need to figure out, how is this thing shaped? And so again, I go through the pattern and I look at how many stitches do I cast on, and how long do I have of that many stitches? And then how does the stitch count change because of shaping increases or decreases? So I go through the whole thing and I draw it out, and then I figure, and then I can see what the pieces look like, and I can see how big the pieces are, maybe, if I know what the row gauge is. What's really nice about this 1960s pattern is it's telling me a row gauge, and then it's telling me how frequently to do the shaping, so I can calculate how many inches that's going to be. And then sometimes it will tell me to knit something to a certain number of inches. So I can get a really good sense of how exactly big every single piece is. And then I can make decisions about, is that what size I want it to be? So I want to do some overhead and show you the schematics that I have drawn and the notes that I have written, so that I can get started on this and know where I might want to make some changes in terms of modifications. So this is a 1960s sweater, and it has a certain length in the torso. I am a very medium-sized person, but I do have about an extra inch of length in my torso, and some of these vintage styles hit the natural waistline or very close to it, and my natural waistline is a little longer than that. So that's something that I am going to be watching out for. So you like to use for something like this, where they are not necessarily giving me finished measurements, they're giving me stitch counts, but I do have a gauge. So I know that the original pattern is 8 stitches per inch. So I'm going to use one of these little squares to represent 1 inch. And so I have to do some calculations. If they tell me how many stitches to cast on, I need to divide it by the gauge in order to figure out how big that is. So I have 2 sets of numbers in here because I was going back and forth with the gauge I'm actually going to be using and the gauge that the pattern was designed for. So this pattern comes in 5 sizes, and they say easy fitting for bust size 34 inch, 36, 38, 40, and 42. I have a 38-inch bust, but they don't tell me what the finished measurement is. I know that I want a 40-inch sweater. This is a pretty fine gauge. I really don't need too much in the way of ease, but I would like a little bit, and I don't really know what they mean by easy fitting. So when I look at the picture, it looks like maybe it's form-fitting. I don't really know. So I look at the instructions, and they tell me to cast on 144 stitches for size 38. And at 8 stitches per inch, I know that that's 18 inches. So I have my center line right here, and I know I have 9 inches this way and 9 inches that way. So I'm using 1 square per inch. So they tell me to knit the ribbing for 2 inches. So I have 2 squares. So this is my ribbing. Now they're telling me to switch to a larger needle for the stockinette portion, and they're telling me to knit for 6 rows. Well, the gauge is 8 stitches per inch and 10 rows per inch. So that is just a little bit over a ½ inch. And then after that, they want me to do an increase. So after I've worked the 6 rows, they want me to do an increase on the next row, and then every 10th row after that, until I've done that 8 times altogether. So if we think about this, they want me to do increases every 10th row, and there are 10 rows per inch. So they are wanting an increase every inch. The other thing is that they want me to do this for a total of 8 times, so that I'm going to have 8 increases altogether. So, but what they're telling me is with 8 increases, that's 1 inch. If I have 8 increases altogether, that's 1 inch, and I'm doing it I have an increase every 10 rows, which is every inch. So that I know that it's 7 inches away from here. If I have an increase at the beginning and the end, that's actually 7 inches to get those 8 increases. So I know that this is going to be an inch wider over here, and it's going to be the same over here. So then I can see that this sweater body is getting shaped like this, and then it tells me to knit straight until it's some number of inches. It depends on what size it is. It could be anywhere from 12.5 to 13.5 inches, depending on the size. And this is the place where I might add, say, an extra inch. I really have to look and see where the sweater is going to hit me. But I might add an extra inch of fabric in here just because I have a long torso. So then we get to the underarm, and they're saying to bind off 4 stitches at the beginning of each of the next 2 rows. So at the beginning of this row, bind off 4 stitches. Well, what's 4 stitches? 8 stitches per inch, that's half an inch. So I'm binding off a half an inch of fabric here. I knit across and then on the wrong side row, a half an inch there. So then I need to decrease on the right side rows, a stitch at each end, every right side row 15 times. So that's, 30 rows. Well, again, 10 rows per inch, that is 3 inches. So after I do those initial bind off rows, then I have 30 rows where I'm getting rid of 30 stitches, 15 stitches at each edge. So I'm getting rid of almost 2 inches here over the course of a little bit more than 3 inches when you include the bind off. So, and then it says to work straight until the armhole is whatever it needs to be for that particular sweater size. For some of them it is 7 inches, and some of them it could be 7.5 or 8 inches, depending on what size you're knitting. And so for my size, it needs to be 7.5 inches deep altogether for right here. So I have an armhole that's 7.5 inches deep, and I have a body that is like 13.5 inches, I think. 13 inches. So I have 20.5 inches I have up to the shoulder. And then I have a series of bind offs for the shoulders. It's like 10 stitches or 9 stitches every at the beginning of each row, and it's done multiple times. And so that creates an angle. It's about 3/4 of an inch at each side here. And then you bind off the back of the neck. So now I know what this body shape is, and I can see how that goes. So I do the same exercise for the front. In this case, when you start out with the ribbing, you also have you're also starting out with the button band or the buttonhole band, depending on whether you're doing the right front or the left front. So you establish that first buttonhole, you knit your 2 inches of ribbing just like you do for the back of the sweater, and then you put these stitches on hold, these 12 stitches, and you're only working with these. And so again, you have a little bit of straight, and then you work at the same increased rate that you worked for the back. So the edges here are matching exactly what's going on in the back. So what happens after that is establishing that shape for that yoke. And in this case, because this is a sudden sleeve, and so the armholes is shallower than with something like a modified drop shoulder or a drop shoulder, what they're doing for this sweater is they're starting the neckline decreases at the same time that they start to bind off. So, so you start doing these decreases, and you want them to end at the same time that you have reached the entire height that you need for this armhole. So remember, this armhole has to be 7.5 inches deep altogether after you do the shaping for the armhole here. And so what they have done, again, they're doing this for 5 sizes. So some of these sizes have the same armhole depth, but more stitches across. So what they have done is they've given the same decrease rate for every single size, and that decrease rate is 4 decreases for every 6 rows. So you might do a right side, a wrong side, skip the right side, then do wrong side, right side, skip the wrong side, and then you repeat that. So they have every size working at that decrease rate until you get to the point where the number of rows left that you have to work in order to get this final height is equal to the number of decreases you have left. So for some of the sizes, you can just work this same decrease rate all the way to the top until you have like a couple stitches left, and then just knit them together until everything, and knit the 2 together to fasten them off. But for some sizes, you're working in this 4 decreases every 6 rows, and then you get to a point where, well, I have 12 stitches left and I still have like 12 rows left. And at that point, they're having you decrease every single row. So right side and wrong side, every row, in order to reduce the total number of stitch count. So the point is for this to end at the same time that you have reached this top point. So even with other sizes, as long as you have a stitch to row gauge ratio that's pretty reasonable, that rate is going to work pretty well for a lot of sizes. So that's how that works out. And the way that they're placing these decreases is a couple of stitches in. So they're having you work 2 stitches, knit 2 stitches, and then work a decrease. And they want the decrease to lean in this direction. So so on this side, they're saying knit 2 together through the back loop or purl 2 together through the back loop. I would use an SSK or an SK or a SSP so that it would not be a twisted decrease on here. And then on the other side over here, those would be knit 2 together or purl 2 together, depending on right side or wrong side row. And once you get the body of that done, then you come back to do the button band. Finish the button band. You come back and you use your smaller needles and you knit your button band all the way up until you hit this point, and it's, you know, slightly stretched and it gets to this point. And now, as you're going to keep working this ribbing, and you're going to increase at the same rate that you did your decreases over here. So you're knitting this yoke separately and this button band separately, and then you've knit the body because it's on smaller needles. So once you have filled in the space, once you've gotten all the way up here and you have the same number of stitches that you would have had for the back, then you do shaping, just shoulder shaping, just like you did for the back. But you do not bind off the 12 stitches for right here. And instead, you knit this for another 2.5 inches because that back of the neck is 5 inches wide. And so you knit this 2.5 inches longer so that it can wrap around the back of the neck. And then on the other side, it comes around the back of the neck and you join it together. And so you have to sew this edge right here to the back of the neck. But that's how that yoke is functioning. I do the same thing for the sleeve. Figure out, you know, it's the same thing. How many decreases and how often are those or increases, and then, you know, how long is the sleeve supposed to be altogether? And then they have the shaping rate for over a certain number of rows, so you can figure out how long that lasts and how many stitches you're decreasing over that period of time, so you know how much narrower the fabric is going to be. So I did this using the gauge and the size that that are indicated in the pattern, the size I wanted, and the gauge that the pattern called for. And then I went back and said, okay, well, what if I'm working at a gauge of 7.5 stitches per inch? How many stitches would I need at each point? And just confirm that that is what the pattern says for the next smaller size. I'll be talking about this more as I go through the process. Well, that's it for this week's Casual Friday. If you have any comments or questions about today's video or suggestions for videos you'd like to see in the future, you can leave those down in the comments below or join the discussion in my Ravelry group, Rocks. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you next week.